people are in. Oh, okay. Do we have to click that?
You're on.
Okay.
People are in.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Lee, the president of the China Society of Southern California. This program is a joint program sponsored by the China Society of Southern California and the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. And naturally, we'll welcome all of you to attend. As you know, the program is being recorded. I guess maybe I'll start right away and I hope that people who come late will catch up with us. Susanna Ferrell is the curator of Chinese contemporary art at LACMA. And she not only has an academic background in the contemporary art field, but she also, according to Stephen Little, has made friends and acquaintances with many, many of the contemporary artists in China who have been in the shows that she has helped curate. And I guess maybe that's the best way to study contemporary art because there isn't that much written about it. And naturally, I think you should talk to the artists and see what the artists are doing. A couple weeks ago, she had a Zoom program with one of the Chinese artists. And the thing that I remember is that the artist himself said, you know, sometimes contemporary art is difficult to understand. You really, I mean, if you look at it cold, without any background, without any understanding of what the artist is trying to do, sometimes there are a lot of question marks and no answers. And I think one of the great things about LACMA has been that if they have a program and we ask to have a curator or somebody speak about the program, they almost always oblige. So it's been, I think, a wonderful thing for us in China Society that we have been able to unlock some of the keys to Chinese art, and especially in Chinese contemporary art. Susie is returning to China Society. A couple of years ago, there was a major exhibit of Chinese contemporary art at LACMA, and she was the curator. At first, I had asked Stephen Little, and he said, no, you must have Susie do it. She's the expert in this field. And she really wowed us. I mean, we really got an understanding of the allure of matter. And likewise, she has been the curator for Legacies of Exchange, which is the current exhibit of contemporary Chinese art that's at LACMA. Last month, Stephen said he pinch hit for her, and he pinch hit for her, and he did a great job, of course, but he did it because she was busy installing this new exhibit, which she's going to talk about, Ink Dreams. Anyway, after the program, we're going to have a Q&A, and the Q&A is not limited just to questions about Ink Dreams, but if you have any questions about Legacies of Exchange or the things that you saw at last month's program, or if you've seen the program, please put these in the Q&A and we'll try to get them answered following Susie's presentation. So let's get started with Susie's presentation.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. And again, thanks for having me back to give another presentation to the society. I'm very happy to be here. Yeah, as Bob mentioned, I know that Stephen briefly went over legacies last month. So in the Q&A section at the end today, please feel free to ask questions about that show as well. It's been a quite busy summer and now fall for Chinese contemporary art at LACMA, but it's a privilege to be able to have this much fun. Tonight, I'd like to give a little introduction to the show that just opened up in mid-September, Ink Dreams Selections from the Fondation INK collection. I'll go ahead and start us right off. Let's see here. Okay. So back in 2016, which feels like about a decade ago, given the year we just had, or 2 years we just had, we received some very exciting news at LACMA that the collectors Dora and Gerard Cogny, two French collectors living in Geneva, Switzerland, were considering donating a part of their collection to the Chinese art department at LACMA. The Cognys appreciated that LACMA had a strong contemporary collection, but equally historical holdings that could help connect the art in their collection to the past. They saw ways that their collection could connect the people of Los Angeles, both through the large Asian diasporic communities, as well as the young scholars from our local universities, looking to the 20-something Asian art history program in or around Los Angeles. We were thrilled when they decided to make the promised gift of the Fondation INK collection, a group of 400 works of contemporary art, mostly in ink on paper, but also including photography, installation, ceramics, sculpture, and other media. I've known Gerard and Dora Cogny for about 10 years now. I actually met them on one of their collecting trips back in 2011, 2012. And I've come to understand that they have a very unconventional approach to collecting art. So instead of looking solely at the physical materials when considering what they're bringing into their collection, materials like ink and brush, paper and silk, the collectors considered ink art holistically and chose works that captured the spirit of this centuries-old mode of painting, no matter the materials or the place of origin. In line with the philosophy of the Fondation INK collection, Ink Dreams offers a reevaluation of what defines the genre of ink art during contemporary times. And in the midst of a swiftly globalizing art world, instead of looking at objective qualities of the genre through time, therefore, I looked to recognize the soft qualities of ink art in curating this exhibition, and realized that there is a spirit of ink that transcends materials or place of origin. This might seem like an ultra contemporary mindset, but there's in fact a tradition of ink artists traversing these boundaries. Let's see, let's get us to the example of that. Okay. So for example, although most ink painting has historically been enacted by East Asian artists, no history of Chinese court painting would be complete without mention of Giuseppe Castiglioni, the Italian Jesuit missionary who spent half a century painting in the courts of emperors Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong. His style fused Chinese and Italian traditions, adopting the Chinese mediums of ink and mineral pigments as well as compositional elements, while relying on the style and techniques of his training in Renaissance Italy, resulting, for example, in a composition of three-dimensional horses sighted against a relatively flattened landscape. We see this as well in artwork of the 20th and 21st centuries. Michael Cherney, whose work is included in the Fondation INK collection, for example, is an artist who was born in New York and has Jewish heritage, who has been deeply committed to replicating East Asian ink aesthetics in his photography since the 1990s. Neither Cherney's heritage nor his use of photography acts to remove him from the ink art lineage. Chinese ink artists throughout history have foregone their traditional instruments on multiple occasions, letting fingers, fingernails, lotus pods, husks, scrunched up paper, splashing techniques, or even their own hair take the place of the brush in an experimental fashion. Furthermore, historically, Chinese ink artists were confined to using the tools of their time. Photography was simply not an option for artistic experimentation during, say, Castiglioni's time. And when photography did enter into the canonical ink painter's artistic domain, ink artists were drawn to it. For example, Zhang Daqian. Zhang Daqian is exemplary as an experimental ink artist on the cusp between ink tradition and modernity. Although he originally painted in the traditional Shui Mo Hua style, he shifted his style to incorporate expressive, dynamic splashed ink in the 1960s. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, he took this expansion of the genre of ink art even further when he collaborated with the photographer Hu Chongxian to create photographs that looked like bird and flower paintings, complete with Zhang's ink-on-photo calligraphic inscriptions. Although it's impossible to say whom of the past masters of Chinese ink art history might have experimented similarly with new media, one might posit that more liberal artists of centuries past might have similarly leaned into an opportunity to create art in such a revolutionary new medium. Oh, I'm sorry. I believe I've stopped sharing. There we go. Okay. So there are three themes that arose when I was looking at the Fondation INK collection. Apparitions, or works with a sort of ghostly use of transparent layering and negative space. You can see in these two works by Dai Guangyu and Ri Qibong. Meditations, calm, repetitive, and contemplative work, in some cases inspired directly by Buddhism, and dreamscapes, landscape works that subvert the traditional ink shanshui in one way or another. I'm going to show you a few works in the exhibition throughout this talk, but I should say that, seeing these pieces on a computer screen versus seeing them in real life is an entirely different experience. For one, the scale of the pieces in the Fondation INK collection is not really conveyed on a slide, and I would say with these pieces, for example, both are sort of medium-sized in relation to the collection, and probably about, for the Dai Guangyu, probably about 4 feet tall and 5 feet wide, and the work by Ri Qibong is closer to 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide. But pieces in the collection go up to about 11 feet high and 14 feet across, so it's really quite monumental at times. From Dai Guangyu's landscape ink ice, the apparition comes not from the layering or blurring of images, the absence of ink, or the use of light values. Instead, this long-form performance photograph shows the traces of what once existed. On the left, the viewer is presented with an image of the character Shanshui, painted in ink on a frozen lake. On the right, the characters are blurred, indicating the passage of time and the changing of the landscape, but maintaining traces of the original ink. Ri Qibong has a layered approach to his work. He begins with a thin layer of fabric where he paints his first painting. Then he obscures this further by adding a layer of plexiglass with about an inch of space in between. And on top of that layer of plexi, he adds additional paint, creating a three-dimensional image, really, that moves as you look at it. So I tried to ground all of the themes in this exhibition in history, to create these through lines from history to contemporary practices. The idea of apparition painting originated with the Southern Song Dynasty Chen monk Zhirong. Although none of Zhirong's works have survived, his painting style was described by his contemporary as being truly unique. Most of his forms were painted in extremely pale, watered-down ink, to the point where it was difficult to see, dotted with deep black details, for example, used in painting facial features. His paintings were in between a state of presence and absence, as if the intention of the painting was not to depict a figure or landscape, but to evoke the idea that one was missing from the scene. The artists featured in the Apparition section of Ink Dreams weren't necessarily directly inspired by Wang Lianghua painters, but many of the featured artists do share aesthetic characteristics with this style and the muted quality of these early Apparitions works. For example, the work of Lin Tianmiao and Min Byung-hun, as seen here. Both use a very limited, subtle range of grays and whites. While in both of these works, details are blurred or muted, they differ from the Wang Lianghua tradition in obvious ways. No pointed black ink details, no quick, loose brush strokes, really no brush or ink at all in these cases, since they're both photographs. And Seeing Shadows, Lin Tianmiao's work, incorporates the addition of her signature white thread. These pieces take an important component of the Wang Lianghua tradition, however, and extend it out. They give attention to and explore that quality of a muted scene, the nostalgia and uncertainty that it evokes. So outside of this specific Wang Lianghua tradition, depictions of mist and clouds equally embody the qualities of an apparition. They have their own history in Chinese ink art, used to break up the foreground, middle ground, and background of a landscape, for example. However, these mist or fog forms are depicted through an absence of ink. It's much more common for artists to have historically used the white paper or silk ground to take on these forms than it was for them to use white pigment. Like the aesthetics of Wang Lianghua, this trend has also transitioned smoothly into the contemporary art world. Use of absence or mist is a defining factor in the tones and compositions of the works of, for example, Wu Zhizong, artist seen here. However, in still life 12 Buttercup Tree, the mist is not mist, the tree is not a tree, and the still life only appears still. It's actually a nearly static video advancing at a lethargic pace. In Buttercup Tree, Wu depicts the gradual progression of water being poured into a glass tank and inundating a cutting of buttercup flowers that has been dislocated from the earth. Wu uses these tricks to simulate a scene from a gardenscape, a bird and flower painting, captured as heavy clouds of mist roll through. In both subject matter and composition, the artist presents viewers with a work in the same mode as a bird and flower, showing a spray of branches against a blank white backdrop. Traditionally, this backdrop would be the pure white of blank paper. Here, brush and paper are absent, but not missed. In Apparition, we can also see as a layer, something translucent, again, not quite present, which itself has long been an important component of ink painting. The styles of meticulous gongbi or fine line painting and loose ink and wash both rely upon techniques where the artists layer ink, usually to build up color. One method, often used by contemporary and historical ink artists alike, is to begin by painting vast washes of ink followed by darker details. This is similar to the method of defining details with dark ink that was employed in the Wang Lianghua style, but without such a high contrast of light and dark. Another example of the coloring technique, of a layered coloring technique, is Santhan Joran, which is a technique that the artist Yang Jietang takes to an extreme in his 100 Layers of Ink series. Santhan Joran is 3 layers of alum, 9 layers of dye, basically. So by inserting a water-resistant alum between layers of pigment, the vibrancy of the pigment is fully preserved, and the colors are not muddled as they would be if they were layered while wet. In Yang Jietang's fingerprint right ring finger series, which is part of his 100 Layers series, the artist uses ink and alum to build up this thick, sort of topographical layered painting. This is another piece that it really helps to see in person, because although this layered ink makes for an extremely dark black, the artist adds a layer of glue on top of the work to create his image, here a fingerprint. When lit correctly, this piece changes in appearance depending on where you're standing, as the light creates a sheen. Repeated layering is also important in the artist Zheng Chengbin's practice. Zheng's technique layers ink and acrylic on the front and the back of Schwann paper. The acrylic creates areas of resist to the watery ink, manifesting natural fractals through the combination of hydrophilic and hydrophobic paints. Another major theme that I saw in the Fondation INK collection was Zen Chan, or meditative works. This section includes artists who have consciously or unconsciously incorporated meditation into their works through repetition gesture, paralleling the repeated utterance of Buddhist chants or the meditative practice of repeated sutra writing, so that the words or writings are recognized as empty of meaning. Contemporary artists like Li Huasheng and Shiraze Hoshieri, whose work I'll show in a few slides, echo this meditative repetition by tirelessly repeating a mark. Li Huasheng's grid paintings, like the work that you see here, were initially inspired by lines of chanting monks, witnessed by Li when he was staying in various Buddhist monasteries in Tibet during a 10-year period of retreat that he took in the 1990s. These constitute a phenomenological record of Li's life. Like the chanting of monks, the construction of a grid involved a deeply meditative process, each line requiring patience and emptiness, repeated until the whole was filled. The vivacious Li was often able to point to a section of any particular grid and recall the events occurring as he reached that part in his painting process. The experiences and thoughts that came to him during the creation of the work, which sometimes extended over months, are forever embodied and embedded in each grid. Zhang Yu's fingerprint works, on the other hand, are at once self-portraits, rubbings, and meditations, repeated stamps of his fingerprint in water, red ink, or black ink. Though the fingerprint is understood as a marker of one's unique identity, its ubiquitousness in Zhang's oeuvre erases its singularity, presenting it instead as both a tool and a material. These pieces can be read as performance works, and his printed papers as documents of those performances, a record of his life and act of artistic creation. From a spiritual mindset, He is enacting a process of self-cultivation that requires great patience and willpower, repeating the same small mark until the paper is completely covered. In Fingerprint 2007, which is in the show, Zhang used only water to impress his fingerprint upon the paper. His series of water-only fingerprints de-emphasizes the two-dimensional patterning of the mark, the actual print of the finger, and instead shows us an impression in the round, each motion creating a small indent in the surface of the paper. Although it's not always recognized as a conscious meditation, the practice of repeated mark making has been a significant trend in the global contemporary art world. Artists like Irma Blank, Mari Kujasalo, and Shirza Hoshieri, among many others, have cultivated practices around their signature repeated marks. Similarly to Li Huasheng and Zhang Yu, in the work of British-Iranian artist Shirza Hoshieri, the final product is not merely a painting, but a physical product of the time spent by the artist to create the work. It is the artist's intention that her works, quote, capture the rhythm of her breathing. That the works, quote, find the essence of my own existence, transcending name, nationality, and culture. The Fondation INK collection also includes sculpture that fits within this practice of repeated mark making. Take Kitamura Junko's ceramics, shown here, glazed with tiny, intricate dot patterns that she fastidiously carves out and then fills. These artists embrace painting as a meditation itself, a daily practice lasting decades, and a truly integral part of the lives of both artists. Park Se-bo is one of the most eminent artists in Korea today, the father of the Danse-kwa movement of abstract, minimalist, and monochromatic art that emerged in South Korea in the 1970s, and embeds spirituality and self-emptying in repetitive action on his canvases. Over the past half century, his oeuvre has been anchored by his ongoing écriture series, which evolved with the artist as his practice matured. The series was born out of frustration. In the late 1960s, Park watched his 3-year-old son as he toiled over his handwriting, trying to fit his characters into the squares of his older brother's gridded practice paper. After writing and erasing again and again, he finally scribbled over the crumpled paper in defeat. This inspired the first of Park Se-bo's écriture series, which consisted of him scrawling in paper over wet paint on canvas, constituting a quiet record of the artist's hand and his arduous process. The second stage of his series began in the 1990s, creating furrows and neutral colors on wet hanji paper. And in the final stage, an example of which we see here, he kind of came to this very mature version of this practice where he combines the repeated furrows of the paper with this breathing hole, as he calls it, a flat zone in the middle of the work that allows for the eye and the spirit to have a place of rest and emptiness. However, in order to have meditation, you have to have more than just repeated gesture, right? Or else things like, washing the dishes and driving and entering data into a spreadsheet would count. This isn't to say that that couldn't count, but meditation also requires of us deep contemplation. I've never known an artist who more required this deep contemplation of his artwork than Qiu Shihua. It is only through prolonged looking that one can perceive the faint mountains of Chou's nearly white landscapes, appreciated over time, and to see the subtle colors that he uses, as in fact he uses only red, blue, and yellow paint and does not use white in his paintings. Bing Yi understands meditation as connection through time and space, and believes that painting is able to connect wanwu, myriad things. Her paintings, therefore, are as well objects of contemplation. Bingyi is one of the artists in this exhibition who actively associates her work with Buddhism and meditation as well. Like Bingyi, Lu Shoukun recognizes his work as meditative in his series Zen paintings. Though Lu, Bingyi, and other artists in this section are studied in Zen or Chan Buddhism, and others practice meditation, these qualities are not essential to making meditative artwork. I have a wonderful quotation from Lu Shoukun that I really think sums this up. Quote, "The apprehension of Zen does not depend on a person's worshiping the Buddha or reading the sutras or being a Buddhist monk. The basis of Zen is man's nature, that is to say, the individual man's original nature, and it is fundamental that the apprehension of it to be sought by cutting through the intellectual process and using means other than the reasoning faculty. These conceptual, soft qualities of meditative art allow for the subject's seamless transition into contemporary art practice, complementing abstraction, minimalism, and performance art, among other forms." They're not solely Buddhist artists, not solely artists who are actively meditating through their work, but for anyone who has kind of embraced this natural understanding that Lu Shoukun discusses. Finally, we end up with dreamscapes. So for those of you who are quite familiar with historical Chinese painting, you might be familiar with the 6 principles of Chinese painting, which Xie He established in his record of the classification of old painters in the mid-6th century. Of the 6, 2 were deemed of the utmost importance. So the first principle, Qi Yun, or spirit resonance, the energy that's communicated by an artist through their painting, that kind of resonates across time and space to the viewer. And the third principle, that the painted image should relate to the formal likeness of the subject. These principles pretty much stood untested for centuries until they were finally challenged in the Northern Song dynasty. Beginning in the Northern Song, literati intellectuals deprioritized capturing a landscape's formal likeness and instead sought to paint artworks that reflected their interior worlds, the inner landscapes of their minds. This landscape might have plants that would not naturally grow together. It might have streams flowing as if from nowhere, or craggy cliffs that could not physically bear their own load. This principle endured through the centuries to follow. I like to quote this poem by Su Shi, 11th to 12th century writer and artist, that says, "If anyone discusses paintings in terms of formal likeness, his understanding is close to that of a child." Certain contemporary artists still embody these principles in their landscape paintings, depicting landscapes that at once subvert the tradition of ink landscape painting in some way, while also establishing themselves as part of this continued timeline of ink landscape history. Let's see some examples here. For example, Xu Bing. Artists like Xu Bing have subverted the landscape tradition to reflect the current environment and notably increased pollution. Here we see Xu Bing and Mr. Kuan Yi viewing a work in Xu's series Background Story to the right, along with the work's Inspiration, an ink painting by modern ink artist Lu Shoukun, which is also in the Fondation INK collection, entitled Wood Houses in the Mountains and painted in 1964. In Xu's series Background Story, he recreates specific landscape paintings from Chinese ink art history using dried grasses, leaves, and trash in place of ink and brush, here using Lu Shoukun's work as inspiration. The resulting composition is flattened behind the front pane of a light box, disguising the work's component parts, but affecting the appearance of an ink painting. To the right, you can see in the back of the light box, and on the upper left, the appearance of the piece from the front, which is nearly identical to the original ink painting. Some artists, like Li Huayi and Kim Ho-duk, show little interest at all in depicting a fully fledged landscape. The greatest intrigue of their landscapes, in fact, is not the scene itself, but the pattern-like repetition of a single or several forms found in nature. Li Huayi uses cracks in a stone surface or the roots of a tree. Kim Ho-duk uses these kind of meditative mountain forms composed through the use of spontaneous repeated peaks. Schwann, as well, creates his landscapes through the use of a repeated mark. His rivers and mountains are perhaps the most easily mistaken of this grouping as purely abstract works. Again, as is true with the meditations and apparitions section, this subject can aptly be communicated through photography as well. For example, in the works of Huang Yan and Haibo, which translate the subject to this modern medium, each showing us that a landscape that depicts elements of reality and composes these elements in a way that produces a surreal end result. See the work of Haibo here as well. In Wang Tiande's work, you really need to know the lore, the mythology of the process to fully understand Wang Tiande's technique. The burning and layering for which Wang Tiande is now known came out of a chance happening when, in 2002, ash from the artist's cigarette fell onto his paper, searing a hole into the surface. In his practice today, he intentionally burns his ground, using a lit stick of incense in place of a brush to paint his landscapes and calligraphy. The result encapsulates two types of negative space, so the white unburnt part of the paper and also the hole left by the burning incense stick. In Untitled, the burnt and painted layers each depict a slightly different landscape with different calligraphy. Some of the black ink showing through white paper as he uses two layers. So giving us, in the end, not two, but three different image planes. The negative space incense drawing, the calligraphy visible through the drawing, incomplete kind of cut off abstract wisps, and then the muted but complete calligraphy discernible through the thin white paper. Finally, the dreamscapes that are created by Chen Haiyen are, in fact, based on the artist's dreams. Chen goes one layer beyond these kind of original literati artists. So instead of simply letting her waking subconscious flow out onto the paper, she actually is inspired by the kind of late night processing of her unconscious mind. The works in the Fondation INK collection represent sort of a microcosm of her career. So we have one woodcut print that's shown here, that's included in the collection. And then also a painted work a little later in her career that uses this kind of wet ink with sort of more broken ink lines included. The dreams in these works are transcribed and translated for this exhibition and can be found in kind of our digital guide, which has come to replace labels during pandemic times. But in this dream in Horse and Rose, Chen Haiyen basically goes over coming across this horse-drawn cart that's loaded up with flower pots that are too heavy for her to bring home, and then going to try to meet her son, but coming into all of these different, very human, very real, very kind of anxious troubles that block her from doing so. All right, so in conclusion, through these three paradigms of historical ink art, meditations, apparitions, and dreamscapes, Ink Dreams explores the implications of what it means to be ink art in the contemporary art world. This is not the finite makeup of ink art, the ink, brush, and paper, nor the place of origin that define a contemporary ink artwork or a piece that resonates with contemporary ink art, but an interest in these established subjects and aesthetics. To transition the field of ink art into contemporary times requires a revision of the way that the genre is defined, as its current context is strikingly different from its historical origins. One must consider what has happened since the introduction of these original genres of Zen painting, Wangliangpa, and the literati landscape, the expansion of Buddhism across not only Asia, but the entire world, the development of new mediums, the revolutionary introduction of the internet and its effect on cross-cultural communication, the urbanizing physical landscape, among, of course, an overwhelming amount of cultural and artistic development that has occurred over the past 2 millennia. So now, I'd like to transition to a short Q&A. Thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to add a question if you have any. And as Bob mentioned before, I'm happy also to answer questions about the Legacies of Exchange exhibition if anyone has some left over for that.
Okay, well, I don't see any questions in the chat yet. So, Bobby, do you have any questions?
Well, I had some questions about legacies of exchange. There was a painting that had Chairman Mao's head and the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what was the meaning of that?
So this work, this piece by Yu Johan was part of a larger series that Yu Johan did. All kind of images of Mao that were reinventing the way that his portraits had been painted during the Cultural Revolution, changing it from being this kind of godly figure with a halo around his head floating in the sky to being something much more human. So he worked on this series to kind of humanize Mao, but at the same time was adding in kind of sardonic touches to the work. For example, in this piece, he has floral prints like all around his clothing, all around the scene with the Statue of Liberty as well. And this was partially an effort to kind of recall the patternings of fabrics that were present at the time that Yu Johan was making this work, but also to I guess, bring him down to earth a little bit more. The pairing with the Statue of Liberty is, of course, sort of doing the opposite of it. It's blowing him up to be at the same scale of this figure of freedom, basically. And so these pieces should be taken as sarcastic, as kind of ironic works, is how Yu Johan was trying to position them.
Oh, I have a question here in the chat. It's from Patricia Thompson. Where do these artists live? Did I miss hearing you say this?
Yeah, so no, you didn't miss hearing me say that. They vary. So this exhibition includes artists from all around the world. I'd say the majority are from China and are currently living in China. Kind of the second largest group would be artists living in other parts of East Asia, including Singapore, Korea. We have artists from Taiwan, Japan, Vietnam in the collection. And then a smaller portion still would be artists living in Europe and North America. So they're from all over. I wanted to show how, ink is not something that's only confined to Asia at this point, or solely confined to Asia and Asian diasporic populations outside of Asia. It's something that has strongly influenced artists from all over the world.
Tell me, do these artists start off training as a traditional styles, traditional calligraphy and whatever, and traditional painting, and then move on to contemporary art, or is it the other way around? Do they?
Yeah, so it really varies depending on the artist. A lot of the Chinese artists, especially in this exhibition, were born during the 1950s and 60s, and were sort of part of this first generation of contemporary artists who were able to re-enter art institutes that had been closed during the Cultural Revolution. So in those places, they were taught everything from kind of traditional ink art practices to specifically printmaking, and also kind of traditional practices in printmaking, to other artists who went abroad and studied oil painting practices, and then kind of came back to ink after doing so. It really varies depending on the artist.
Let's see, there's oh, hold on a second. Okay, so here's a question from Patricia Thompson. Would you please say something more about the growth of the use of ink for traditional brush painting to the dream quality of brush ink and water? I could paste that in the chat for you so you can.
Yeah, that would be great. So the transition from, growth of the use of ink for traditional the dream quality. I'm sorry, I'm not 100% certain what this is asking based on the phrasing. Quality of brush, ink, and water. I mean, I guess I would say basically the way that ink evolved over time, over centuries. There were artists who were experimenting with kind of pushing the medium to its boundaries, even from centuries ago all the way up to today. So in kind of earlier centuries of using ink, this meant pushing it to the boundaries of, how faint can we get this wash of ink? How wet can we get this brush stroke? How can I communicate something with an incredibly dry brush? And those kinds of experiments, of course, grew into different modes and different trends in ink painting throughout the centuries, and also kind of lended themselves to creating these dreamy qualities of translucent washes, of the use of blank paper as a compositional element, and also kind of moving with these trends of the literati to convey something that was more spiritual and more dreamlike than something that was completely finite.
Let's see. I don't think there are any more
Oh, I
questions.
have a question about the legacies.
Yeah.
There's that painting with the Spanish princess with the
Yeah, the infant.
guy's head. I guess he's quite well known for having all these funny heads on people. What does the head represent?
Yeah, so Yeminjun, he's made a series of works with this pink laughing man, which is really a self-portrait for Yeminjun. These were initially a reaction to the Tiananmen Square massacre. Yeminjun felt like he couldn't really convey how he was feeling in his artwork at that time, for fear of repercussions. And so instead, he painted this laughing pink man, kind of a mask as to how he was truly feeling. Initially, when he started painting these works, Yueminjun was recreating pieces that had kind of had some resonance with the Tiananmen Square massacre. That had, for example, images of like prisoners being shot. But he gradually transitioned away from this to bringing the laughing man into scenes from kind of all over the art historical canon. And it was at that time that the pink laughing man sort of lost a little bit of the original meaning and took on more the meaning of the self-portrait of Ye Minjun. So these pieces show Ye inserting himself into this art historical canon.
Here's a question from Carol. Please remind me, did you mention that the brownish paper is more a Western preference, not Chinese preference?
The brownish paper. People don't really usually use a brown paper. When you look at like historical Chinese ink paintings, for example, the browning is usually due to age. Ink paintings are very light sensitive, and when they're exposed to light over time, the paper will brown. But for the most part, they're starting out white.
Well,
What are the properties of the Schwann paper? They said the XUAN paper. Is it specific for something that takes in ink or?
Yeah. Schwann is a paper that's really been favored by a lot of ink painters throughout history. It's a mulberry pulp-based paper that absorbs ink in a way that a lot of people like. It's quite absorptive and does so in a way where you can't really go back. It's difficult to take ink up out of the paper after it's been laid down. It's quite a sturdy paper too.
I think that's all the questions we got.
Well, I think maybe she can give an announcement about this study day.
Yes, so I did want to announce that we have a study day in association with this exhibition that's going to be taking place on Wednesday morning. It'll be from 10 a.m. to 12:30. and is going to feature a few of the artists from the exhibition talking about their pieces, as well as myself and two other scholars, curators, talking about specific works in the exhibition. We would love to have you there. If anyone in the Historical Society or the China Society are available. And we have a link for it as well. I don't know. I can send that link to you, Bob, or to circulate around, or what would be the best way to get you a link for that?
I guess you could do that, but isn't it also on the LACMA site?
Yes. So here, I'll stop sharing my screen so I can find. But it's, if you search for the LACMA, if you search LACMA Study Day Ink Dreams in Google, let's see if we can get it that way. Yeah, so it's on October 6th. Here, I'll also just put a link into the chat right now in case anybody wants to access it there to make it much easier. Wait. Oh, I can't actually, but thank you. Perfect. Yeah, so RSVP is required because we have a limited capacity due to COVID restrictions, trying to keep it safe for everybody. But yes, please feel free to RSVP. We would love to have you there. And thank you so
And the bonus is that both exhibits, the Legacy of Exchange and the Ink Dreams, will be available for people to see it on a Wednesday when the museum is closed.
Yes. So it's kind of like a private view, peek into the museum when we aren't normally open. So, yeah.
Tell me, will there be docents at the exhibits or docents later at the exhibits?
I'm not sure if there will be. I would expect that there will be docents trained for these exhibitions, but we haven't done that docent training yet. So hopefully in the sometime throughout the fall or early winter.
How well labeled are the things at Ink Dreams?
So everything actually has pretty extensive labels for both Ink Dreams and Legacies of Exchange. However, the way that you access them is by scanning a QR code at the entrance of the exhibition. Once you scan the QR code, you'll see the labels for the whole show, basically. There are also labels on the walls in both of them so that you can see, kind of line up which work goes with which description. Yeah, so I highly recommend using the digital guides by scanning the QR codes at the start of the exhibition.
Tell me, what else is in the ink collection that you will be getting? Are you eventually going to exhibit most of the things?
Yes, so we will be receiving 400 works from this collection. This exhibition has 78 works in it, so about a fifth of the whole collection. This includes, additional works by some of the same artists who I showed, as well as other artists. They have quite an extensive collection of some really fabulous calligraphy. So we're planning a calligraphy exhibition coming up in 2023. So something to look out for.
Well, I think many of us should know that the Huntington has a small exhibit of calligraphy, and they also have several programs on calligraphy, which I think are very informative. And I think that probably we should try to see all of those before your 2023 program.
Sounds like a plan. Yeah.
Mhm. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I guess I can let Susanna go. And once again, I had a wonderful experience with your talk, and I look forward to seeing the exhibit, both of the exhibits again. The other thing, I guess, is that we will have some other announcements. We are going to have at our next meeting, David Hughes. He is going to also return to China Society. Many of you might remember that he gave us programs on Mandarin squares. He had co-authored a book with Beverly Jackson on Mandarin squares called Ladder to the Clouds. And he has come out with a new book, and I think he will have a new lecture for us. So that will be on November 1st. So please plan to come to that one. The other thing that, oh, and then of course I want to thank the Historical Society and the people who helped us. Of course, our speaker, Suzanne, and Felicia. And we've had a request to open up our Zoom program so everybody can see one another. So as we're closing this program, we are going to, I think we are going to unmute everybody and put everybody, what do they call it? Open the video also, so you can see who's here and wave hello and whatever. So I know it's been over 2 years since we've had a personal meeting. So I hope everybody will at least be able to see everybody's faces. And I guess maybe you can unmute yourself also. We're going to open up the thing.
I'll work on that. So I'm going to stop
okay.
recording so we don't have to record this part. And then
Oh,